My name is Margaret Ellery, and I am 62 years old. For most of my life, I believed I had mastered the delicate art of staying quiet around people who mistook volume for wisdom. I was married for 38 years to a gentle, thoughtful man named Paul, and even though he passed away 5 years ago, I still feel the warmth of his steadiness anchored deep inside me. After his passing, my son Andrew and his wife, Clara, became the closest thing I had to daily family. I saw them often, shared dinners, helped with their children, and kept a simple and peaceful rhythm. But peace is a fragile thing. Sometimes all it takes is a single sentence, tossed casually by someone certain they are the center of the universe, to fracture it. My fracture arrived on a soft Sunday afternoon, sunlight pouring across my daughter-in-law's kitchen island. We were discussing the possibility of Andrew and Clara buying their first home, and I had offered to help them understand the mortgage paperwork. I'd spent my career in financial analysis. Numbers were my old friends. That was when her father, Lawrence Brandt, my eventual antagonist, leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said, "Why don't we let the men handle the money, Margaret? You focus on the grandkids." It was said like a joke, warm enough to pass as harmless. But it carried the stale scent of a man used to speaking without ever being challenged. A man who had built his identity on the shaky scaffolding of superiority. He was 72, retired, and clung to two things as tightly as some men cling to religion, the belief that he was always right, and the importance of everyone else believing it too. I didn't like him, but I tolerated him. For my son. For my daughter-in-law. For the grandchildren who adored him because they had not yet learned to see the difference between charm and condescension. Still, something shifted inside me that day. A small click. A quiet turning of some inner dial. I felt it even as I smiled politely and kept my tone light. "Oh, Lawrence," I had said, "I handled corporate finances for over 30 years. I think I can read a mortgage document." He laughed. He actually laughed. "Computers probably did all the work for you. It's a different world now, Margaret. Leave the big decisions to the men." I glanced at Andrew. He didn't laugh. But he didn't correct his father-in-law either. Conflict makes him uncomfortable. Always has. So I let the moment settle like dust on an old table. I didn't fight. I didn't push. I didn't snap back. I'd learned long ago that real power is quiet, collected, patient. And if someone underestimates you, that is not an insult. It is an advantage. I felt the first ember of an idea forming, though I didn't yet know what shape it would take. Only that something in me refused to shrink merely because a man with outdated ideas needed the illusion of control. And as I gathered my purse and said my goodbyes that afternoon, one thought lingered like a whisper. He has no idea who he just spoke to. 2 weeks after that kitchen incident, something happened that turned Lawrence's harmless insult into something more corrosive. I wish I could claim I expected it, but even after 62 years of watching people reveal their cracks, I was surprised by the speed and boldness of the betrayal. It began when Clara called me in a tight, embarrassed voice. "Mom. I think there's a problem with the money we set aside for the house." Instantly I understood. I didn't ask how. Instinct moves faster than logic. "What happened?" I asked calmly. She hesitated, and in that pause, I felt the entire pattern of events lay itself out like a map. "Dad thinks, well, he thinks you're pressuring us. That you want control of the finances. So he convinced Andrew that it's safer if he manages the house funds until everything's finalized." So there it was. Behind my back. Without a word to me. I asked where the money was now. "He moved it," she said. "Into an investment fund he oversees for the family. He said he's done it for years. He said men need to protect the bigger financial picture, and we shouldn't burden you with stress at your age." At your age. The phrase landed differently. I could practically hear him saying it in that dismissive, rhetorical tone of his, the tone that treated disagreement as a personal inconvenience. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sigh. I simply asked, "Did you and Andrew agree to this, or did he pressure you?" Silence, long enough to know the answer. "He made it sound reasonable," she whispered. "And Andrew, you know how he is. He didn't want a scene." So Lawrence had taken control of my family's financial decisions, not just dismissed my expertise. He had rearranged their future, inserted himself into a space that wasn't his, and treated my decades-long career like a quaint hobby. But what struck me hardest wasn't the insult. It was the familiar ache beneath it. I had seen men like him in countless conference rooms, men who talked over me, took credit for work I did, sidelined me because I didn't want to drink whiskey with them after hours. Men who believed leadership was a birthright granted by their gender. But I had also outlasted every one of them. And I had risen higher. Quietly. Strategically. Predictably underestimated. "What company does your father work for now?" I asked. "He still consults for a logistics firm," she said. "Bay Ridge Transport." The name struck a memory. Years ago, their financials had crossed my desk. Sloppy record-keeping. Untapped potential. Poor oversight. A company that could flourish with the right leadership, someone who understood numbers, efficiency, and ethics. Someone like me. As the pieces clicked into place, I felt no anger. Only clarity. Crystal sharp. "Clara," I said softly, "don't worry. I'll take care of this." I meant it. Just not in the way Lawrence expected. And as I hung up the phone, one thought settled with perfect heaviness. He told me to let the men handle money. He's about to regret every syllable. The next morning, I woke early, brewed tea, and sat at my dining table with a stack of old notebooks. People think financial analysts rely on software, but the best ones develop a personal system, a way of seeing patterns before the numbers even appear. I flipped through the notebooks, tracing years of decisions I had guided, companies I had repaired, and crises I had steered through. I had lived an entire professional lifetime being underestimated. When I started in the late 70s, senior executives called me "sweetheart" without irony. They assumed I was taking notes, not leading strategy. They assumed my quiet meant I lacked ambition, when in truth, I simply didn't waste energy on theatrics. By the time I retired, I had saved 3 companies from collapse. I had trained entire teams in ethical financial practice. And I had built enough savings to live comfortably, more than comfortably, truth be told. But I never flaunted it. It wasn't my way. Which is precisely why men like Lawrence made a fatal mistake. They judged the surface and missed the depth. They saw softness and believed it signaled weakness. But my softness has always been discipline. The kind that holds, and waits, and chooses its moment. I thought of my late husband, Paul. He had always admired that about me. "You don't need to prove your power," he used to say. "You simply use it when it matters." This mattered. Because Lawrence wasn't just meddling. He was controlling the financial future of my son and daughter-in-law, and by extension, my grandchildren. He was planting his flag in the middle of their autonomy and calling it protection. And people like him rarely stop at one intrusion. I remembered the stories Clara had timidly shared over the years. How her father pressured them about how to raise their children. How he inserted himself into every major decision. How his advice always came tied with a thread of judgment. At first, I had believed she exaggerated. But age sharpens intuition, and intuition had long been whispering that Lawrence was not merely stubborn, he was controlling. There are 2 kinds of control. One that shields those you love, and one that cages them. Lawrence favored cages. And as I flipped through my notebooks, I found the one page I was searching for, a quick assessment I had done years ago on Bay Ridge Transport. Back then, it was barely afloat but full of potential. The company had since expanded, according to Clara. And more importantly, its ownership structure was fractured, multiple shareholders, several nearing retirement, a board vulnerable to the right offer. I knew its weaknesses because I had documented them. I knew its strengths because they were obvious to anyone who understood logistics margins. Lawrence valued status more than money. I knew that about him. He liked being the wise elder, the one people needed. He needed that company's consulting role to maintain his identity. And just like that, the motive behind his arrogance crystallized: he needed to feel superior. He needed to feel indispensable. He needed to feel like the man who held the power. But he had made a tactical error. He forgot that I had power too. Quieter. Sharper. More patient. And far more precise. Buying a company is not an impulsive decision. It requires information, leverage, strategy, and timing. Luckily, those were languages I had spoken for decades. I began by researching Bay Ridge Transport's current financials. Public filings, investor reports, employment listings, trade articles, every scrap of data told a story. And the story was remarkably familiar. Strong demand. Weak leadership. Aging board. Chaotic organization. High potential disguised by sloppy oversight. It was exactly the type of company that could be transformed with the right hand at the wheel. And I suspected, based on the numbers, that Lawrence's consulting role was more honorary than essential. Companies like Bay Ridge tended to keep older men in advisory positions out of habit rather than necessity. He was likely a relic of the previous structure, pleasant enough to have around, cheap enough to keep, and stubborn enough to believe he mattered more than he did. I called an old professional acquaintance, Amelia Porter, a mergers attorney who had the sharpest mind I'd ever worked beside. She picked up on the first ring. "Margaret," she said warmly, "I haven't heard from you in ages. What can I help you with?" "I need a quiet acquisition," I replied. "Discreet. Efficient. And I need the preliminary analysis by the end of the month." She paused, but she didn't ask why. We had that kind of relationship. "Send me the company name." "Bay Ridge Transport." "Ah," she murmured. "Interesting choice. That one's vulnerable." I smiled. "I know." With Amelia on board, I had the first pillar of my plan. The second came from a series of private meetings with minor shareholders, most of whom were surprisingly eager to sell. Retirement plans, exhaustion, uncertainty about the company's future. All it took was meaningful listening, respectful offers, and a calm, professional presence. 3 weeks later, I held enough shares to request internal access. 5 weeks later, I was reviewing internal performance data. 7 weeks later, Amelia informed me that controlling interest was within reach. During those weeks, I didn't confront anyone. Not my son, who assumed I had simply moved on. Not Clara, who apologized every time she saw me. And certainly not Lawrence, who resumed making snide comments about how women get emotional about money. I ignored him cheerfully. His underestimation was the fuel of this entire operation. But there was a moment, small, almost forgettable, that confirmed I was doing the right thing. Clara had pulled me aside after dinner one night. "Mom," she whispered, "Dad's been making Andrew feel like he can't make decisions without him. It's getting worse. He's telling him how to manage the kids, the house fund, even his job decisions. Andrew won't stand up to him. He feels guilty." Guilt. The oldest leash in the world. I felt a certainty settle into my bones. This wasn't just about a disrespectful comment. This was about freeing my family from a man who wielded control like a scepter. I didn't need vengeance. I needed justice. And justice was already unfolding, step by meticulous step. 8 weeks after my investigation began, I had enough financial insight to see the company's entire skeleton. And what a skeleton it was, riddled with inefficiencies, outdated software, poor asset management, and a leadership team asleep at the wheel. It wasn't malicious. Just stagnant. But I noticed something else, tucked deep in the advisory budgets. Lawrence's consulting retainer had quietly increased over the years. Not by much, just enough to slip under attention, but steadily, consistently, and without documented justification. This wasn't criminal, it was simply unethical. Slightly parasitic. He had been quietly feeding off a struggling company, enjoying the prestige of being their senior advisor while providing minimal input. I also uncovered several memos he'd written to the board, filled with outdated strategies and recommendations that belonged in the 1990s. They weren't harmful. Just useless. The kind of thing companies tolerate because challenging it requires energy. But here was the important part. The company was tanking under advice like his. That was the truth that clicked everything into place. His arrogance wasn't supported by competence. It was supported by habit, everyone else's habit of not pushing back. One evening, after reviewing the final internal audit, I sat back in my chair and let the weight of the truth settle. Lawrence had spent years believing he was the backbone of a company whose own numbers showed he was dead weight. That realization became the cornerstone of my next move. Because the best revenge is not humiliation. It is truth unveiled in a way that cannot be denied, rewritten, or twisted. Amelia called me as I was finishing the report. "Margaret, the last 2 shareholders are ready. If you want controlling interest, it's yours." I breathed out slowly. "And the board?" "Exhausted," she said. "They're begging for someone with real leadership to take over." Of course they were. The numbers told the story clearly: drop in profits, increase in overhead, slow bleed of opportunity, and an aging advisor clinging to relevance. "Then prepare the acquisition documents," I said. "I want everything finalized within 2 weeks." As I hung up, I allowed myself a rare smile. I wasn't taking the company out of spite. I was taking it because it needed someone competent. Someone with vision. Someone who understood that leadership meant responsibility, not ego. But yes, I will admit, there was a poetic symmetry in the fact that Lawrence had told me to let the men handle money, and 8 weeks later, I was preparing to buy the company that still propped up his importance. Yet the story wasn't complete. Not yet. The confrontation still lay ahead, calm, factual, irrefutable. And I intended to deliver it with the same elegance I brought to every major decision of my career. The confrontation took place on a quiet Saturday evening, around the dinner table at Andrew and Clara's home. I had chosen the setting deliberately: familiar, safe, neutral. A place where no one expected conflict and yet everyone needed clarity. Lawrence arrived with the same smug confidence he always carried, shoulders back, voice booming, ready to dominate the conversation. He poured himself a drink, settled into a chair, and immediately began advising Andrew about a job promotion he hadn't even been offered yet. I waited until after dinner, when the plates were cleared and the children were upstairs. Only then did I fold my hands neatly on the table and say, "I'd like to discuss a matter involving Bay Ridge Transport." The room stilled. Lawrence blinked at me. "What could you possibly know about that?" "Quite a bit," I said calmly. "I purchased controlling interest in the company last week." Silence fell like a curtain. Clara gasped softly. Andrew's fork clattered against his plate. Lawrence stared at me, confusion sliding into disbelief, disbelief sliding into insult. "You're joking." "I don't joke about finances," I replied. I reached into my bag and laid the acquisition packet on the table. Amelia had prepared it neatly: board approvals, shareholder agreements, and the formal appointment of a new executive restructuring committee. His voice rose. You can't just buy a company." "You can," I said gently, "if enough shareholders want to sell and the board approves the transition." His face reddened. "Why would they approve you?" I met his eyes steadily. "Because they need competence. Because the company has been declining under outdated advisement." He flinched. A small movement, but telling. I continued, still calm. "Your consulting role has been reviewed. The board and I agree that your contributions have not aligned with the company's current needs. As part of the restructuring, your advisory contract will end in 60 days. He leaned forward, voice trembling with indignation. "You're pushing me out." "No," I said softly. The numbers pushed you out. I simply listened. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief. She understood. She had lived under his control her whole life. Andrew looked stunned, caught between loyalty and awakening. Lawrence whispered, I've given that company decades. And you were compensated for it, I replied. But it's time for new leadership. That's normal. It's healthy. It's how companies survive. He tried one more tactic. You did this to embarrass me. I shook my head. I did this to protect my family and to save a company that deserved better. Your disrespect was not the cause. It was simply the moment I realized how deeply you underestimate the people around you. For the first time since I met him, Lawrence had no rebuttal. No insult. No armor. Just silence. I gathered the documents, slid them back into my bag, and stood. This isn't revenge, Lawrence. This is accountability. And with that, the confrontation ended, not with shouting, but with truth. The aftermath unfolded slowly, as consequences often do. Lawrence withdrew for several weeks, stunned and wounded. His ego had taken a blow he couldn't disguise, and without his consulting title, he no longer had a pedestal from which to preach financial superiority. Clara later told me that he had spent days pacing his house, muttering about betrayal. But even she began to see the situation differently. She told me quietly, Mom, he's realizing people aren't afraid of him anymore. For the first time in her life, she felt free to set boundaries. Andrew struggled too, but in a different way. He grappled with guilt, then clarity, then relief. One evening he came to my home and sat with me on the porch. I didn't realize how much control he had, he said. I thought I was keeping the peace. I didn't realize I was losing my voice in the process. Most people don't realize, I said gently. Control is often disguised as concern. He nodded, eyes lowered. Thank you for stepping in. I should have. You will, from now on, I said. That's what matters. Meanwhile, the company itself responded well to the restructuring. The employees, many of whom had been exhausted by the stagnation, welcomed the clarity and direction. I hired a young, brilliant operations manager who had been overlooked for years. I implemented modern systems, cleaned up finances, and opened communication channels that had long been blocked by outdated bureaucracy. The shift was immediate. Efficiency increased. Morale improved. Profits began to stabilize. Within 3 months, the company was no longer limping. Within 6 months, it was thriving. The board expressed gratitude. The employees thanked me. And ironically, even the shareholders who had sold their stakes reached out to congratulate me, impressed by the transformation. But the most profound consequence unfolded within the family. Lawrence, without the artificial authority of his consultant title, became noticeably quieter. More hesitant. More human. He began listening instead of dictating. He apologized to Clara one afternoon, awkwardly, imperfectly, but genuinely. And although he never apologized to me, he no longer spoke to me with condescension. He greeted me respectfully. He deferred when he didn't understand something. He learned, slowly, that influence must be earned, not imposed. My grandchildren sensed the shift too. Their home became calmer. Their parents more unified. The undercurrent of tension that had followed every family gathering began to dissolve. There were no dramatic outbursts, no cinematic collapses. Just steady change. The kind that lasts. And as the company flourished and my family found its balance, I realized something unexpected. The true consequence was not Lawrence's loss. It was everyone else's gain. Now, at 62, looking back on everything that happened, I understand that this story was never about destroying a man or humiliating him. It was about restoring balance, within a family, within a company, and within myself. When Lawrence told me to let the men handle money, he assumed age and gender-determined competence. But competence comes from experience, integrity, and clarity. It comes from listening, learning, adapting, and caring. The quietest person at the table is often the one who sees the most. My revenge was not a dramatic strike. It was a deliberate act of correction. I did not scream. I did not insult. I did not sabotage. I simply allowed the truth to speak louder than arrogance. And in the end, truth did what truth always does, it illuminated everything. The company now stands stronger than ever, guided by leaders who bring both modern insight and genuine care for their employees. My son and daughter-in-law have grown into a confident, united front, unburdened by the subtle chains of someone else's expectations. Even Lawrence changed. Slowly, yes. Imperfectly, of course. But people do change when they face the honest consequences of their behavior. His voice softened. His presence gentled. He became a grandfather, not a general. And as for me, I did not reclaim my professional identity, I never lost it. I simply let it sleep for a while, waiting for the right moment to wake. I share this story because many people, especially women of my generation, have been underestimated, dismissed, or talked over. We have been told to shrink, to defer, to be polite at the expense of truth. But silence is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is gather the facts, remain steady, and let your actions speak. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it signs acquisition papers. Thank you for listening to my story. If you'd like more stories like this, stories of quiet revenge, emotional truth, and thoughtful justice, let me know. I have many more to tell.